The middle class is not usually destroyed by one dramatic event. It is destroyed by a squeeze. That is the first thing I want you to understand. A squeeze is more dangerous than a crash because a crash gets your attention. A squeeze makes you adapt slowly while your financial position quietly gets worse. You pay a little more for gas, a little more for groceries, a little more for shipping, hidden inside every product, a little more to travel, a little more to heat, cool, move, repair, and replace. None of it looks fatal by itself. That is why people underestimate it. But a long enough squeeze can do what a spectacular panic cannot. It can wear down an entire class of people, one recurring bill at a time. That is what oil does when it becomes a shock instead of a background price. Most people hear the word oil and think about the gas pump. That is childish. Oil is not just the price you see on the sign outside a station. Oil is movement. Oil is transportation. Oil is agriculture. Oil is freight. Oil is logistics. Oil is the hidden energy cost embedded in nearly everything a household touches. When oil jumps, life does not become more expensive in one place. It becomes more expensive everywhere motion exists. And since the middle class lives on earned income, fixed obligations, and confidence about tomorrow, an oil shock does not just hurt its budget. It attacks its structure. That is why I do not think of an oil shock as a commodity story. I think of it as a tax on motion. That is the mother line of this whole story. When oil rises violently and stays high, the economy has to carry a new tax on movement. Every truck, every flight, every delivery, every harvested crop, every commute, every supply chain, every business that touches the physical world starts negotiating with that tax. Some pass it on, some absorb it, some cut hiring, some cut investment, some cut people, and households, especially middle-class households, are forced to pay the bill multiple times without always recognizing that it is the same bill. That is how people get wiped out without ever seeing one villain. The villain is the squeeze itself. History is useful here because it reminds us that an oil shock is rarely just about oil. It becomes a catalyst that exposes where the economy was already weak. That is why these episodes so often rhyme with recessions. Oil did not merely rise in the past. It tightened the entire system. It collided with fragile consumers, fragile businesses, fragile confidence, and fragile policy choices. That is why I respect oil shocks so much. They are not isolated disturbances. They are amplifiers. But this time there is something nastier about the setup. The economy is not entering an oil shock with a clean labor market, relaxed consumers, and an untouched corporate structure. It is entering the shock while artificial intelligence is already reorganizing work. That combination is what makes this dangerous. One pressure would be hard enough. Two pressures stacked together can break people who thought they were merely under stress. The first mechanism is what I call the motion tax. A lot of people cannot understand why oil matters so much because they think in categories, not in systems. They imagine gas prices hurt drivers, plane tickets hurt travelers, and heating bills hurt homeowners. They do not understand that oil seeps through the whole economy like dye in water. Transportation costs change. Input costs change. Food costs change. Distribution costs change. Business margins change. The final price of ordinary life rises in a dozen places before the household even understands what happened. That is why I call it a motion tax, because every time something has to move, the tax is there. And modern life is built on movement. Groceries move from field to warehouse to store. Packages move from manufacturer to ship to truck to porch. People move from home to office to school to appointments to second jobs. Raw materials move. Finished goods move. Spare parts move. Workers move. Machines move. When oil shocks, the tax on that movement rises whether you vote for it or not. Now think about what that means for a middle-class family. Its wages do not automatically reset upward. Because oil surged, its mortgage does not become easier. Its child care bill does not become smaller. Its insurance does not get friendlier. Its grocery basket does not become lighter. A family that was already trying to manage fixed obligations now has to absorb higher variable costs without being offered any magical increase in income. That is why the middle class gets hurt so deeply by prolonged energy shocks. It lives in the gap between what it must pay and what it can renegotiate. Wealthy people can absorb more. Very poor people may already be supported in ways that partially cushion certain hits. But the middle class is often expected to keep functioning, keep paying, keep commuting, keep consuming, and keep believing. That is what makes it vulnerable. It is rich enough to have responsibilities, and poor enough to feel every increase. If the shock is brief, the system can limp through it. If the shock lingers, the motion tax begins eating the confidence that middle-class life depends on. And confidence is more important than most people realize. That leads to the second mechanism. I call it the confidence drain. Economists like to use sterile words for this. Sentiment, expectations, consumer confidence. I prefer plain language. People spend when they believe tomorrow is survivable. They hold back when they believe tomorrow might punish them. That is not irrational. It is human. A household deciding whether to replace a car, move to a larger home, take a vacation, renovate a kitchen, or even make ordinary retail purchases is not running a spreadsheet in a vacuum. It is making a judgment about safety. Do I trust my job? Do I trust my income? Do I trust prices to calm down? Do I trust that the next 6 months will not punish me for spending today? Once oil shocks and starts lifting the visible cost of living, households begin answering those questions more defensively. That defensive posture matters because consumer spending is the bloodstream of the economy. If enough people step back at once, businesses notice very quickly, not because consumers vanished, but because they became cautious. That caution is not random. The motion tax causes it. A family does not need to suffer bankruptcy to become economically weaker. It only needs to become less willing to spend. The car purchase gets delayed, the discretionary trip disappears, the bigger home becomes impossible, the dining bill gets trimmed, the new electronics wait another season, repairs get postponed, shopping behavior turns from expansion to conservation. And when millions of households do that together, the economy starts slowing even before the official language catches up. This is one of the reasons I care so much about confidence. It is not just a psychological curiosity. It is one of the main transmission systems through which an oil shock becomes a broader economic event. People say prices matter. They do. But the fear of future prices matters too. The fear of future instability matters. The fear of a weaker job market matters. Confidence is where the squeeze becomes behavior. And once it becomes behavior, it stops being a headline and starts being a macro force. That brings me to the third mechanism. And this is where the current setup becomes much uglier than a simple oil story. I call it the double replacement. The first replacement is economic. Higher oil prices replace household purchasing power with household stress. The dollars that used to go toward optional life get reassigned toward mandatory life. The second replacement is technological. AI is replacing some categories of labor faster than many workers expected. Those two replacements are now happening at the same time. That is what makes this period so dangerous. In a normal slowdown, the labor market may hold up long enough for people to keep spending. In a normal automation wave, lower input costs or easier consumer conditions may soften the blow while the economy reorganizes. But when you combine a motion tax with a labor reshuffling, you create a more sinister setup. Consumers pay more for life at the same time. Businesses have more reasons to cut, automate, or delay hiring. That is the double replacement. One force hits the household from the spending side, the other hits from the income side. That is how the middle class gets cornered. A worker hears that AI is making firms more efficient and thinks that sounds abstract until friends start losing jobs, junior roles disappear, or corporate language changes from growth to productivity. Then the oil shock arrives and makes every trip, every bill, every business input, and every consumer choice more expensive. The household is now squeezed by a shrinking sense of labor security and a rising cost structure at the same time. That is not a simple recession risk, that is a life structure risk. Because most middle-class financial plans assume at least one of two things will hold steady. Either costs remain manageable, or income remains stable enough to outrun them. If both become unreliable, the whole plan starts to crack. This is why I do not laugh when people say a commodity move can ripple into the job market. They say it as if it were an exaggerated second-order effect. It is not exaggerated. Businesses do not experience higher oil as an academic point. They experience it in freight, utilities, input pricing, travel, margins, customer demand, and investor expectations. And when those pressures coincide with technology that offers an excuse to reduce payroll, you get exactly the kind of behavior that slowly weakens the labor market before people fully recognize it. The company does not always say, "We are firing people because of oil." It does not have to. It only needs to say, "We are optimizing." The result for the household is the same. That takes us to the fourth mechanism. I call it the lagging scoreboard. One of the great ways people get fooled in markets and economics is by worshiping scoreboards that update too slowly. They want a recession label, they want GDP confirmation. They want a neat declaration that the economy is now officially good or officially bad. But those labels come after pain has already begun doing its work. The economy does not wait for the scoreboard to change before it starts hurting people. A household can feel poorer long before economists agree on what to call the quarter. A worker can lose bargaining power long before a headline declares a labor shift. A business can freeze hiring long before a recession is technically recognized. That is why I dislike relying on official declarations for practical financial decision making. They are descriptions of what has already happened, not operating instructions for what to do next. GDP is important, but it is backward looking when you are trying to protect your own life. Recession definitions are useful for textbooks, but far less useful for deciding how to allocate capital while events are still unfolding. This is where oil shocks trap the inattentive. The data lags, the labels lag, the committee language lags. The human experience does not. You feel the motion tax now. You feel weaker confidence now. You see hiring hesitation now. You watch companies talk more openly about automation now. You notice households shrinking their behavior now. The scoreboard will catch up later. By the time the label arrives, the disciplined investor has already been living in the reality for months. That is why I care more about mechanism than terminology. I do not need a recession label to know that rising oil can weaken spending. I do not need a formal announcement to understand that AI-driven layoffs can alter household behavior. I do not need a television panel to tell me that when those two things happen together, certain assets will get repriced and certain strategies will become more attractive. The lagging scoreboard matters because it creates one of the biggest advantages for serious people. It allows them to act while the crowd is still waiting for permission. The fifth mechanism is what I call the pressure sorting. Every shock in the economy is also a sorting machine. It separates households, businesses, and assets according to how much pressure they can survive. A mild environment lets weak structures pretend they are strong. A difficult environment reveals who is sturdy and who is merely lucky. Oil is particularly good at pressure sorting because it touches necessity. A household can delay some purchases, but it cannot stop living. A business can trim some ambitions, but it cannot avoid the energy and motion costs embedded in physical reality. That means the shock quickly sorts participants by resilience. Households with no margin get exposed. First, businesses with weak margins get exposed next. Sectors reliant on discretionary spending start to wobble. Companies tied to basic necessity hold up better. Assets dependent on endless optimism get hit harder. Assets tied to hard needs or protected cash flows may prove more durable. This is why I think so many people misunderstand what it means to invest during a shock. They think the lesson is simply to hide. It is not. The lesson is to understand what the sorting machine is rewarding and what it is punishing. When the motion tax rises, businesses that rely on people feeling flush become less secure. When confidence drains, cyclicals and fragile consumer stories face more risk. When AI reshuffles labor, certain cost structures look more fragile, while other business models become more attractive. When recession fear rises, defensive categories get reevaluated, and when markets sell broadly, disciplined investors get the chance to buy productive assets with better future return potential. That is why recessions and crashes create so many future millionaires. Not because pain is magical, because pain reprices ownership for people who are prepared. But preparation is the whole trick. Without preparation, a downturn is just fear. With preparation, it becomes a discount. The sixth mechanism is what I call the ownership pivot. Most middle-class families have been trained to think like consumers, not owners. They think about what rising oil does to their gas bill. They think about what higher prices do to their groceries. They think about whether their paycheck covers their obligations. All of that is understandable. But if you want to build wealth through a period like this, you have to make an identity shift. You have to move from being only a payer of the motion tax to being an owner of assets that can benefit from or endure the environment the motion tax creates. That is the ownership pivot. A consumer asks, how do I survive higher energy costs? An owner asks, which assets get more valuable, more resilient, or more attractively priced because the crowd is scared of higher energy costs? A consumer asks, what if a recession is coming? An owner asks, which productive businesses or funds will I be happy to own for 10 or 20 years if I can buy them at better prices now? A consumer wants relief. An owner wants terms. That shift matters because it changes your response to volatility. If you think only as a household payer, every downturn feels like pure threat. If you think as an owner, downturns become mixed. They still hurt in the present, but they also create better entry points into future productive cash flows and compounding systems. That is one of the great paradoxes of wealth building. The same event that makes current life more uncomfortable can make future ownership more attractive. Most people never exploit that paradox because they never make the identity shift. They stay trapped as watchers of their own bills instead of buyers of future value. I would not recommend anyone gamble on headlines or pretend they know exactly how every oil path resolves. That is not what I am talking about. I am talking about building a system that lets you become stronger while the environment becomes noisier. That is very different. The seventh mechanism is what I call the panic discount. When households and investors get scared enough, they stop pricing assets based on patient future cash flow and start pricing them based on current emotional discomfort. That is where discounts come from, not from reason alone, from pressure. Fear compresses valuations. Urgency creates selling. People dump good things together with bad things because they want immediate emotional relief. That is where disciplined investors make their money. Not because they enjoy pain, because they understand that if the long-term productive capacity of the economy remains intact, lower prices on good assets are gifts disguised as chaos. This is why I always return to the same principle. I do not need to know what the market will do next Tuesday. I need to know what I am willing to own for the next 10 or 20 years. If the answer is productive American businesses, broad index exposure, durable dividend payers, consumer staples, selective hedges, and carefully chosen structural themes, then lower prices are not insults. They are invitations. The crowd hates this idea because it demands discipline, when discipline feels least natural. But the math of wealth does not care about emotional timing. It rewards the people who can keep buying good ownership through bad moods. That is why I like systematic accumulation so much. Always be buying is not a slogan to me. It is an antidote to emotional drift. If I have chosen sound long-term assets, I want a process that keeps adding to them, whether the market is cheerful, frightened, or confused. Markets go up, I buy. Markets go down, I buy. Markets go down more, I buy more aggressively if my cash planning allows. That is how fear becomes future net worth. It is also how the middle class stops being purely a victim of cycles and starts becoming a beneficiary of them. Now let me give you the blueprint I would respect in a world like this. First, I would recognize that a prolonged oil shock is a hidden cut to household freedom. That means I would tighten the parts of my lifestyle that are optional before the market or my employer forces the decision on me. I want to create slack voluntarily, not under panic cash reserves. Lower unnecessary spending, and a clear understanding of fixed costs matter more when the motion tax is rising. Second, I would stop assuming job stability just because I have a job today. Oil can weaken spending, AI can weaken labor demand. The combination means the prudent household should think in probabilities, not in wishful permanence. That does not mean fear. It means preparation. Third, I would keep buying broad productive ownership. If I believe the American economy will be bigger over long stretches of time, broad market funds, quality dividend funds, and defensive baskets tied to necessities can all play roles depending on what kind of investor I am. The exact mix is personal. The habit of ownership is not fourth. If I wanted more targeted exposure, I would think in mechanisms rather than in slogans. If higher oil stays with us, energy exposure can make sense. If AI remains a deep structural trend, then semiconductors, automation, and related infrastructure may still matter even through volatility. The point is not to chase noise. The point is to own the engines I believe will still matter after the current panic becomes history. Fifth, I would treat gold correctly, not as a magical growth machine, as insurance against monetary foolishness, war anxiety, and inflation distrust. A modest role can make sense. Worship never does. Sixth, I would remember that consumer staples exist for a reason. In hard times, people still buy toothpaste, soap, paper goods, and essential household items. A world under pressure often rediscovers the value of boring demand. I like boring when boring survives. Seventh, I would keep the scorecard that matters most right in front of me, not the GDP label, not the recession panel debate. My own balance sheet, my own savings rate, my own asset accumulation, my own buying protocol, my own ability to stay rational while the crowd wants a diagnosis before it acts. That is the blueprint I trust. Notice what it does not rely on. It does not require me to know the exact duration of the Middle East conflict. It does not require me to guess the next press conference. It does not require me to trade headlines. It requires me to recognize that the motion tax, the confidence drain, the double replacement, the lagging scoreboard, and the panic discount all alter the environment in predictable ways. That is enough. I do not need precision theater. I need structural clarity. Now let me tell you the deepest danger in all of this. The deepest danger is not simply that oil rises. It is that middle-class people continue behaving as if their old life structure still works while the structure around them has changed. They keep spending as if prices will soon normalize. They keep working as if their role is secure, simply because it existed last year. They keep avoiding ownership because markets feel scary. They keep waiting for official confirmation before adjusting anything. That is how people get wiped out. Not by one shock, by slow refusal to adapt. The last time it hurt the middle class because the middle class had to absorb a rising tax on ordinary life. It had to pay more to move, more to heat, more to feed itself, more to sustain routines. And it did so while wage growth and job security did not keep pace. What is happening again now is not identical, but the rhyme is loud enough for me to respect it. And because AI is now part of the picture, the rhyme may be even more vicious than people want to admit. That is why I am speaking this plainly. If you are only a spender in a world like this, you are exposed. If you become an owner, even gradually, you begin to change the way the same environment affects you. That is the threshold. Will you remain someone who merely pays the motion tax, or will you become someone who owns pieces of the economy that survive it, adapt to it, or benefit from the fear it creates? Will you sit around waiting for economists to stamp the word recession on your pain? Or will you build a life and a portfolio that can handle uncertainty before the committee catches up? Will you let rising prices and labor instability push you into paralysis? Or will you let them push you into discipline, ownership, and selective aggression when assets are discounted? That is the real choice. The middle class does not get wiped out all at once. It gets wiped out when it keeps reacting like a customer in a world that now demands it think like an allocator. Do not make that mistake. Because if this oil shock stays, the squeeze will keep spreading. It will move through transportation, food, confidence, hiring, spending, and eventually through asset prices. And when it does, some people will only feel poorer. Other people will quietly use the same environment to buy a larger claim on the future. I know which side I want to be on. You should too.